Once upon a time, there was a family that wanted to rule forever. They built empires, wore crowns, and believed their blood was sacred. But what happens when a dynasty locks its doors and only marries itself? This is the story of the Habsburgs, a family so obsessed with power and purity that they doomed themselves with the very blood they tried to protect. A story of kings with jaws too heavy to chew, of queens who were both cousins and nieces, and of the last heir, born so broken by inbreeding that he became a living symbol of a dying empire. Tonight, let me tell you a bedtime story about love, power, and the curse of incest. The Habsburgs were not just any royal family. They were the spider at the center of Europe's web, kings of Spain, emperors of Austria, rulers of half the known world. Their palaces glittered with gold, their portraits stared down from velvet walls, and their armies marched across continents. For centuries, they seemed untouchable, eternal. But behind the crowns and the titles, there was a secret, a choice repeated generation after generation. Instead of looking outward for love, the Habsburgs looked inward to cousins, to uncles, to nieces. And every wedding was not just a union of power, but also another step into a genetic labyrinth from which they could not escape. In medieval Europe, dynasties believed that keeping bloodlines pure meant keeping power safe. But the Habsburgs turned this belief into an obsession, and that obsession left scars, not just on their empire, but on their bodies, their faces, and their minds. Tonight, we will follow their story from the glitter of their golden age to the shadows of their decline, a story not of dates and battles, but of family secrets, strange marriages, and the tragic fate of a dynasty that tried to outwit time and lost. To understand the Habsburgs, we must first understand their fear. In the Middle Ages, kingdoms were fragile things. Borders could vanish overnight, crowns could slip away with a single unlucky marriage. A daughter given to the wrong prince could carry half an empire out the door. A son who married into another dynasty might raise their flag instead of his father's. The Habsburgs knew this danger better than anyone. They began as minor nobles in the Swiss Alps, yet by careful marriages they climbed higher and higher until their family name was stitched into the very fabric of Europe. And so, the lesson they carried was simple. Marry out, and you risk losing everything. Marry in, and you keep the treasure safe. The church officially forbade marriages between close kin. Incest, after all, was a sin. But the Pope's blessing could erase sins with a stroke of a pen, and the Habsburgs had the power, the money, and the influence to get those blessings whenever they needed them. A cousin became a bride, a niece became a queen. Every generation tightened the circle until the Habsburg family tree looked less like a tree and more like a snake eating its own tail. And for a time, it worked. Their empire expanded, their power grew. The world looked at them and saw not weakness, but an unstoppable dynasty, one that had discovered the secret to eternal rule. But beneath the surface, in the silence of their royal chambers, the cost of this obsession was already beginning to show. The Habsburg family tree was not a tree at all. It was a circle that grew tighter with each generation until every branch bent back upon itself. Imagine a royal wedding, trumpets, gold, velvet, the promise of a stronger empire. Now imagine that the bride is your cousin, or your uncle's daughter, or in some cases, your very own niece. This was not scandalous for the Habsburgs, it was strategy. Take Philip the Handsome, who married Joanna of Castile, better known as Juana the Mad. Through this union, the Habsburgs inherited Spain, the Americas, in unimaginable wealth. But Philip and Juana were not strangers. They were family, and their children would carry not just crowns, but the seeds of a dangerous pattern. The deeper we look into the genealogy, the stranger it becomes. One Habsburg princess could be both a cousin and an aunt to the same child. A young prince might find that his bride was also his double great niece. The family tree folded over itself so many times that historians today sometimes struggle to map it without drawing circles and loops. And to outsiders, it almost looked like sorcery. How could this single family manage to hold Austria, Spain, the Netherlands, Burgundy, and parts of Italy? The answer was always the same: marriage. But behind the glitter, the cost was beginning to mount. Each new marriage was like another twist of the rope, tightening around the dynasty's neck, for while their territories expanded, their genetic pool shrank. The Habsburgs had not built a tree, they had built a trap, and soon their very faces would reveal the price. If you look closely at their portraits, the Habsburgs carried their curse on their faces. The most famous mark, the Habsburg jaw. It was not just a strong chin, it was a deformity so pronounced that some Habsburgs could barely close their mouths, chew properly, or even speak clearly. And it was not a coincidence, it was the echo of centuries of intermarriage. From Emperor Maximilian I in the 15th century to Charles II in the 17th, the portraits reveal the same unmistakable profile: a long face, drooping lower lip, and a jaw that jutted forward unnaturally. Artists painted them with elegance, but reality was far less kind. The physical toll went beyond the jaw. Some Habsburgs were described as fragile, sickly, or plagued by strange illnesses. Others struggled with mental health, depression, fits of rage, even madness. Remember Juana of Castile, called Juana the Mad? Was she truly insane, or another victim of the dynasty's genetics and trauma? Historians still debate. And yet, despite these warning signs, the Habsburgs pressed on. King Philip IV of Spain married his very own niece, Mariana of Austria. Their son, Charles II, the most tragic example of what centuries of incest could produce. But before we reach him, the dynasty's human time bomb, let us pause and consider this irony. The very strategy that made the Habsburgs Europe's most powerful family was now carving weakness into their bones and shadows into their minds. If the Habsburg Dynasty had a ghost, it would be Charles II of Spain, the boy who was meant to inherit an empire, but instead became the living symbol of its decline. When Charles was born in 1661, the midwives already knew something was wrong. He was weak, slow to develop, unable to walk until the age of 4, unable to speak until he was nearly 8. His body was frail, his mind often clouded, and his famous jaw so deformed that eating was a struggle. But Charles was not just unlucky, he was the product of generations of incest. His parents were uncle and niece. His ancestors had married within the family so many times that his genetic diversity was lower than that of a child born to siblings. One modern genetic study suggests that Charles carried more inbreeding than almost any royal in recorded history. The court tried to present him as a king. Portraits were painted, ceremonies were held, but whispers filled the palace corridors. They called him El Hechizado, the bewitched. Many believed he was cursed, haunted by demons, or poisoned by black magic. In reality, his curse was his blood. Charles was infertile. He produced no heirs. His reign was marked not by victories, but by weakness, confusion, and decline. As his empire crumbled under war and debt, his body too withered. When Charles died in 1700, at the age of 38, his corpse shocked those who saw it. He was described as so ugly and deformed. He was a marvel of nature. His body was covered in ulcers, his organs rotted, and he left no children behind. With his death, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg Dynasty ended. An empire built on power, ambition, and obsession collapsed into war over who would inherit his empty throne. And so, the strategy that had carried the Habsburgs to the heights of Europe finally destroyed them in the body of one broken man. The Habsburgs were not alone in their choices. Across history, powerful dynasties often turned inward, seeking to keep their blood pure. In ancient Egypt, the Ptolemies, heirs of Alexander the Great, married brother to sister, generation after generation. To them, it was divine. Pharaohs were living gods, and who else could a god marry but another god? Cleopatra herself, the last of the Ptolemies, was the product of this long tradition. In Persia, noble families sometimes practiced close-kin marriage to preserve status and wealth. Among certain tribes and dynasties, cousin marriages were a way to strengthen bonds, not weaken them. But in medieval Christian Europe, incest was officially forbidden. The Catholic Church drew strict lines: no marriages within 7 degrees of kinship. Yet lines are easy to erase when a pope's dispensation can wipe them away. For the right fee, for the right alliance, exceptions were granted, and no family exploited those exceptions more than the Habsburgs. Still, the perception mattered. When pharaohs married sisters, it was holiness. When Habsburgs married nieces and cousins, it was gossip, suspicion, and eventually ridicule. And the consequences were impossible to hide. Where Egyptian statues showed godlike rulers, Habsburg portraits revealed drooping jaws and vacant stares. Where other dynasties kept their mystique, the Habsburgs became the cautionary tale, proof that obsession with purity could breed only weakness. In this, their story was not just unique, it was tragic. Because unlike the pharaohs, the Habsburgs did not seem divine. They seemed all too human, trapped by the very system they had built. On November 1st, 1700, Charles II of Spain, the last of his line, died without an heir. With him, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg Dynasty vanished. The empire that stretched from Madrid to Mexico, from Naples to the Netherlands, now stood leaderless. But Charles's death did not bring peace, it brought chaos. Europe erupted into the War of Spanish Succession, a brutal conflict over who would inherit his broken crown. The dynasty's obsession with blood purity had given them empires and then left them nothing but bloodshed, and the world noticed. Other European courts whispered about the Habsburgs long before Charles's death. Ambassadors wrote mocking reports, describing kings with jaws so long they drooled at banquets, or princes so fragile they could barely mount a horse. French courtiers joked that the Habsburgs had married themselves into extinction. Even common people told stories of Charles II as a bewitched king, not by sorcery, but by the curse of his own family. When foreign envoys visited his court, they sometimes wrote with pity, sometimes with ridicule. "The king is more a shadow than a man," one wrote, "his body ruined, his mind weak, his very life a wonder of medicine." And so, the once great dynasty became an object of dark humor. The family that had sought eternal rule became a warning, a grotesque legend whispered across Europe. Yet, while the Spanish branch died with Charles, the Austrian Habsburgs endured. They learned to marry outside the family, to seek new alliances, but the stain remained. To this day, when we speak of dynastic incest, the Habsburgs are the first name we remember. Their story ended not with a bang of triumph, but with the slow, pitiful collapse of a man too sick to rule and too broken to continue the line. a dynasty undone by its own blood. And so, the story of the Habsburgs drifts into legend, a family that once ruled the world, undone not by enemies, but by themselves. In Austria, the dynasty survived. They learned slowly that fresh blood was not weakness, but salvation. Empress Maria Theresa, one of the last great Habsburgs, married her children across Europe, not to cousins, but to powerful allies. From her came Marie Antoinette of France, whose fate would be sealed by the guillotine, but whose blood at least no longer bore the heavy curse of inbreeding. The Habsburgs endured, transformed from emperors to nobles, from rulers to relics of history. Their palaces still stand, their portraits still stare from gilded frames. But their story is no longer about eternity, it is about warning, because in the end, the Habsburgs remind us of a simple truth. Power cannot be hoarded forever. Blood cannot remain pure without turning poisonous. And no dynasty, no matter how grand, can escape the laws of nature. So as you close your eyes tonight, remember the family that tried to cheat time itself. They won empires, they wore crowns, they bent popes and princes to their will. But in the silence of their royal chambers, their secret grew until it consumed them. The Habsburgs wanted to live forever. Instead, they became a bedtime story.